My mother used to say that some people are born to shine and some are born to support the ones who shine. She never said which one I was. She didn't have to. Growing up, my brother was the one with the trophies: soccer, debate, honor roll. Every achievement had a home on the mantel in our living room. My mother dusted those trophies on Sundays. I watched her do it. She used a soft cloth and she was careful, the way you are careful with things that matter. I don't say this to be bitter. I say it because it's true, and because the truest things are usually the ones that take the longest to stop hurting. My name is Simone. I am 31 years old. I am a licensed clinical social worker, which means I spend my days sitting across from people who are carrying things they don't know how to put down. I help them figure out where to set it. I am good at my job. I have been told this by my supervisor, by my clients, by the grant committee that funded our outreach program last spring. I have never been told this by my parents. My brother's name is Adam. He is 34. He sells commercial real estate in Phoenix and makes a very comfortable living doing it. He is tall and confident and has the kind of handshake that makes older men nod approvingly. My parents have always understood what Adam does. They can explain it at dinner parties. They can say, "My son sells commercial real estate," and watch people nod and smile. And that nod and that smile are things my parents collect the way some people collect art. What I do is harder to explain, or rather, they have never tried very hard to explain it. Simone works she works for a nonprofit, some kind of counseling thing. That is the version my mother gives. She says it with a small pause before nonprofit, the kind of pause that does a lot of work. I don't live in Phoenix. I live in Columbus, Ohio, which is where my organization is based. I drove 4.5 hours to be at my brother's wedding. I want to be clear about that. I drove 4.5 hours on a Friday after a full day of client sessions, checked into a Holiday Inn Express because the room block at the venue hotel was already full by the time my mother mentioned it to me, and I was there. I showed up. I have always shown up. The rehearsal dinner was on Friday night. It was at a steakhouse downtown, private room in the back, maybe 40 people. I sat next to my aunt and her boyfriend, who talked mostly to each other. My mother sat at the center table with Adam and his fiancée, Brooke, and Brooke's parents. I watched my mother laugh at something Brooke's father said. She touched his arm when she laughed. She is charming when she wants to be. That is not something I have ever questioned. After dinner, in the parking lot, my father put his arm around my shoulder and said, "Good to see you, kiddo." He said it the way you say it when you mean it a little, but not enough to stop walking. He was already moving toward the car. I said, "You too, Dad." I meant it completely. The wedding was on Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. It was at a vineyard about 20 minutes outside of the city, the kind of place with string lights and a barn that doesn't smell like a barn, and a view of rolling hills that turns orange in late afternoon. It was genuinely beautiful. I want to say that. Whatever else happened, the place itself was beautiful, and Brooke was beautiful, and my brother looked like the happiest person I have ever seen in my life. I was glad for that. I am still glad for that. My parents had mentioned earlier in the week that we might all ride together to the venue. I hadn't pushed for specifics because I didn't want to be a problem. On Saturday morning, my mother called me at the hotel and said they were leaving earlier than planned. They wanted to be there for some of the setup, for photos, and it was going to be a tight fit with the garment bags and the cooler they were bringing, and wasn't it easier if I just drove myself? She said it quickly, the way you say something when you've already decided, and you just need the other person to agree. I said, "Of course, no problem. I'll see you there." I sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a few minutes after I hung up. The room had that specific kind of quiet that hotel rooms have, the kind that feels borrowed. I looked at my shoes, which I had polished the night before. Then I got up and finished getting ready. I found my seat at the ceremony without any trouble. 5th row, groom's side, on the aisle. I knew a few people nearby, some cousins, an uncle. We exchanged the usual things. "How was the drive? You look great. Can you believe he's finally doing it?" I smiled and meant it, and also felt the whole time like I was standing slightly outside of everything, watching through a window. The ceremony was lovely. Brooke cried when she saw Adam. Adam pressed his lips together the way men do when they're trying not to cry, and then cried anyway, just a little. and my mother made a sound beside my father, not quite a sob, just a soft exhale. And I thought, this is real. This moment is real. I let myself be in it. Afterward, there was a cocktail hour on the patio while the wedding party took photos. I got a glass of white wine and found a spot near a low stone wall where you could see the hills. My cousin Felicity came and stood next to me for a while, and we talked about her kids and my work and the drive and the wine. She is easy to be with. She has always been easy to be with. Then it was time for dinner, and I found my place card at the escort table, and I followed it inside. Table 11. I stood in front of it for a moment. The reception hall was large and warm, round tables draped in ivory linen, candles and small eucalyptus arrangements, the kind of setup that costs more than I make in 2 months. Table 11 was against the back wall, not quite next to the kitchen, but close enough that I could hear the clatter of sheet pans when the door swung open. The other tables, the ones with my parents, with the aunts and uncles, with Brooke's family, were clustered near the center and the windows. Table 11 was where you put people you've run out of better ideas for. I sat down. I introduced myself to the couple across from me, who were friends of Brooke's from college. Very nice, very chatty about a trip they were planning to Portugal. There was an empty seat to my left. I arranged my napkin in my lap and looked at the centerpiece and decided that I was going to be fine. The empty seat stayed empty through the salad course. During the main, a choice between salmon and the short rib that arrived smelling extraordinary, a man sat down next to me with an apology and the specific energy of someone who has been in a long conversation he couldn't easily leave. He was probably 60, maybe 65, with silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on his head, and the kind of easy, unhurried manner that takes a long time to develop. He introduced himself as Gerald, and then caught himself and said, actually, he was going to spare me the work title because he always led with it at these things, and it was a bad habit. He asked my name. I told him. He asked how I knew the couple. I said Adam was my brother. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, just a small recalibration, the way someone looks when a piece of information lands in an unexpected spot. Adam's sister, he said. Yes. He talks about you, he said. And then he paused, which was interesting, and said, he talks about you a little differently than your parents do. I didn't know what to do with that, so I asked how he knew the family. He said he'd worked with my father 20 years ago, before he moved to Phoenix, before any of this. He said my father was one of the sharpest men he'd ever worked with, and that he'd always respected him. He said it warmly, without any edge. I believed him. We talked through the main course, about Columbus, about his work. He'd eventually told me something in health policy, federal level, which is when I started paying closer attention, about the vineyard, about the short rib, which he confirmed was as good as it smelled. He was easy to talk to in the way that competent people sometimes are, because they're not performing. He just talked. At some point he asked what I did. I told him about the nonprofit Community Bridge, which provides mental health outreach and crisis counseling in under-resourced neighborhoods on the east side of Columbus. I told him about our team, 8 clinicians, about the federal grant we'd received in March, about the waitlist we were working through, and the school partnership we'd just launched. I told him the way I tell it when I'm not in my parents' living room. Like it's real, like it matters, because it is, and it does. He set down his fork. The Community Bridge grant, he said, that went through our office. I looked at him. I reviewed the application, he said. The program design was exceptional. The outcome metrics, the community partnership model, we don't see that level of rigor very often. He said it the way you say something that is simply true without needing it to be a compliment. That program is going to matter to a lot of people. I said thank you. I said it quietly because it was all I had. He looked at me for a moment. Does your family know about the grant? They know I work for a nonprofit, I said. He was quiet for a second. Then he picked his fork back up. I see, he said, and I could hear everything he wasn't saying. The speeches started not long after. Adam spoke about Brooke and cried again, and everyone laughed in the warm, forgiving way you laugh at a man you love who was crying. My father stood and spoke about Adam, his work ethic, his loyalty, the way he made everyone around him better. It was a good speech. My father is a good speaker when he has a script. My mother dabbed her eyes. I watched from table 11. After the speeches, during the transition to dancing, people began to move around. My father came over to the bar, which was near our corner of the room, and Gerald stood and shook his hand, and they had the reunion that two men who haven't seen each other in 15 years have. All warmth and disbelief, and you haven't changed a bit. I sat and watched and held my wine glass. And then Gerald said, with the same easy, unhurried manner he'd had all evening, "Your daughter has done something really remarkable, you know." My father looked at me. It was a look I am not sure I had ever received from him. Not quite pride, not quite confusion, something in between, like a word he almost recognized in a language he didn't speak. "Simone," he said, "the federal grant her program received," Gerald said. "I worked on that review. The application was one of the strongest we've seen in years." He said it conversationally, the way you mention something that everyone obviously already knows. "You must be proud of her." The pause that followed was not long, maybe 3 seconds, but I have replayed it many times, and I think it was the truest 3 seconds of the entire evening. My father's face moved through something, I don't know what to call it exactly, recognition maybe, or the particular discomfort of realizing that a version of something you thought you understood is not the version that exists. "Of course," my father said. "Of course we're proud of her." His voice was a little different when he said it, a little less certain. My mother had drifted over somewhere in the middle of this, and I looked at her when my father said it, and she was looking at Gerald, not at me, and her expression was the one she gets when she is recalibrating, polite and still and busy underneath. She didn't say anything. Gerald said a few more things and excused himself to find his wife, and my father stood there for a moment and looked at me and said, "Why didn't you tell us about the grant?" "I did," I said, "in March. I sent you both an email." He didn't say anything to that. "I also mentioned it at Easter," I said. "You said that was nice." He looked like he wanted to say something. He looked like there were several things available to him, and he was trying to decide between them, and eventually what he landed on was, "Well, you should have pushed harder." I looked at my wine glass. I looked at the hills through the window, which were purple now in the early evening light. I thought about the 4.5 hours I drove. I thought about the hotel room and the polished shoes and every Easter and Thanksgiving and Christmas where I had sat at a table in my parents' home and been, without anyone saying it plainly, the one they were still waiting to understand. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe you could have asked." He didn't have an answer for that. He nodded once, slowly, and then someone called his name from across the room and he went. Brooke found me later, near the end of the night, when the dancing had wound down and people were saying the long goodbyes that wedding nights require. She had changed into a shorter dress, and her hair was starting to come loose, and she looked happy in the deeply tired way of someone who has been happy all day. She hugged me, a real hug, the kind that reaches the chest, and said, "I'm really glad you were here." "Me too," I said. She pulled back and looked at me. She had known, I think. Not everything, but enough. She was perceptive in that specific way some people are when they've spent time watching dynamics that aren't theirs. "You know he talks about you, right?" she said. "Adam. He tells people his sister works in mental health and makes a real difference. Like, he says it all the time." I didn't know that. I stood there and I didn't know that, and I also, suddenly, believed it completely. "I'll have to give him a hard time about not telling me more often," I said. She laughed and squeezed my hands and went back to her husband. I drove back to the Holiday Inn. I took off my shoes in the parking lot because my feet hurt and I didn't care. The night air was cool and smelled like cut grass, and I stood there for a moment in the dark before going inside. In my room, I sat on the bed. I didn't turn on the TV. I just sat there for a while with the lights off, which sounds sad but wasn't, exactly. It was more like settling, like the way a house sounds after everyone has gone home. I had waited a long time, my whole life, or something close to it, for my parents to see me, and I had spent so much of that time believing that if they just knew the right facts, the accomplishment, the number, the name of the grant, they would understand. That understanding would arrive like a door being opened, What I learned at table 11 is that some people will not open the door themselves. They need someone else to knock first. And that is not your failure. That is just the kind of people they are. I called my supervisor on Sunday morning from the hotel parking lot because I needed to tell someone who would actually understand, and she answered on the second ring. And when I told her what had happened, she said, "Simone, good, I'm glad he was there." And that was enough. That was more than enough. I don't think my parents will change completely. I have been a social worker long enough to know that insight in adults, real insight, comes slow and usually incomplete. What I think is that something shifted slightly, the way furniture shifts slightly when you move it just an inch. It's still the same room, but the light falls differently. My father texted me on Monday. It said, "Safe drive home." He has texted me on Monday. It said, "Safe drive home." He has texted me after visits before, but this time there was a second text, which came about 3 minutes after the first. It said, "We should hear more about your work. I mean that." I read it twice. Then I put my phone down and finished my coffee and got ready for my Monday clients who were waiting, who needed me, who I would sit across from and help carry what they were carrying. That is what I do. I am good at it, and I do not need a trophy on anyone's mantle to know that. I have thought a lot about what actually happened that night, not the surface of it, not the dinner and the string lights and the vineyard hills going purple at dusk, but the thing underneath all of it. The reason any of it landed the way it did. The truth is, nothing that happened at that wedding was an accident. Not the way my parents introduced my brother at every dinner party while trailing off when my name came up. Not the way I kept emailing and mentioning and quietly trying to be seen and then going home and telling myself it was fine. And not the way Gerald, a man I had never met before, who owed me absolutely nothing, happened to sit down at table 11 and happened to work in exactly the field where my work had made a mark. I used to believe that if I just did good enough work, the recognition would find its way back to me, that the people who were supposed to see me would eventually see me. What I understand now is that that belief, while not entirely wrong, was also a way of avoiding something harder, the fact that I had stopped advocating for myself in the one room where it cost me the most. I had decided, somewhere along the way, that it was safer to be quietly competent than to risk being dismissed again. And that decision had a cost. Not to my career. I had built that on my own terms, and I was proud of it. But to my own sense of what I deserved inside my family. I had made myself small in that room for so long that I had started to believe the smallness was just the shape of the space. What Gerald did was not give me something I didn't have. He just said out loud what was already true. And the reason it landed so hard, the reason my father's face moved through that strange, slow recalibration and my mother went quiet, is because the truth had weight behind it. You build that weight over years. You build it by showing up, by doing the work, by being the kind of person that a federal grant committee finds credible. None of that happened by accident. It happened because I kept going even when no one in that living room was counting my trophies. That is the part I want to hold on to, not the moment of being seen, though I won't pretend that didn't matter, because it did, more than I expected, but the years before it. The Monday mornings, I got up and drove to work and sat across from people who needed someone steady. The grant application I stayed up late to get right. The clients on my wait list who I thought about even on Saturdays. I did not do those things to impress my parents. I did them because they were the right things to do, because the work was real, because I believed it mattered even when the people closest to me couldn't quite see it yet. There is something in that worth paying attention to. The life you build when no one is watching is still a life. The integrity you keep when it costs you something is still integrity. And the people who eventually bear witness to it, whether that's a stranger at table 11 or a supervisor who answers on the second ring on a Sunday morning, they are not giving you your value. They are just confirming what was always there. My father texted me 2 days later. He said he meant it, that he wanted to hear more. I believed him a little. I am choosing to keep believing him, because that is the harder and more worthwhile thing to do, not because he earned it completely, but because I am not interested in carrying bitterness into the same rooms I've been working so hard to stand in clearly. I am Simone. I am 31 years old. I help people put down what they've been carrying too long. I know how to do that because I have been practicing on myself for years.